بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our third episode in the series on Al-Qawaid Al-Fiqhiyya, Islamic legal maxims. And today we'll be talking about the first of the 5 major legal maxims, which is Al-Umuru bimaqasidiha. Affairs are judged by their objectives. The word judged is added here in the translation because it's understood. And this maxim, of course, is derived from the famous statement of the Prophet ﷺ, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. Deeds are only by intention. I mean, that's the literal translation. And most scholars are of the opinion that you have to add something there for the sentence to take its full meaning. Because sometimes deeds are done without intention. I mean, you do something unintentionally. So deeds are judged according to the intention. And no deed can be judged without taking the intention into consideration. So that hadith is well known. It was narrated by virtually all of the collectors of hadith. Even though the hadith, it started out as an ahad hadith. It was Umar ibn al-Khattab who narrated it from the Prophet ﷺ. He was the only Sahabi who narrated it. And there was 2 or 3 of the tabi'een, one after another, who narrated it from each other. And then after that it became a mutawatir hadith. It became very, very famous. But despite the fact that it is an isolated hadith, it is backed by so many other evidences of the Sharia. The Prophet ﷺ was asked about a man who fights for the sake of partisan fervor, meaning he fights because it's his group that's involved in the fight. The slogan, "My country, right or wrong." A person who fights because he's brave, or a person who fights to show people that he's brave, or various reasons. People ask the Prophet ﷺ, who among those is fighting in the path of Allah? And he said, the one who fights in order that the word of Allah be uppermost, he is in the path of Allah. And from the Quran you have this amazing passage in Surah At-Tawbah. To help my memory, I'm just going to read it from the book. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ومن الأعراب من يتخذ ما ينفق مغرما ويتربص بكم الدوائر عليهم دائرة السوء والله سميع عليم. And of the Bedouins there are some who look upon what they spend in Allah's cause as a fine, meaning a penalty, and watch for calamities for you, meaning the Muslims in general. On them be the calamity of evil. And Allah is all hearer, all knower. The passage goes on, وَمِنَ الْأَعْرَابِ مَنْ يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ وَيَتَّخِذُ مَا يُنْفِقُ قُرُبَاتٍ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ وَصَلَوَاتِ الرَّسُولِ أَلَا إِنَّهَا قُرْبَةٌ لَهُمْ سَيُدْخِلُهُمُ اللَّهُ فِي رَحْمَتِهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. And of the Bedouins there are some who believe in Allah on the last day, and look upon what they spend in Allah's cause as means of nearness to Allah, and a cause for receiving the messenger's invocations. Indeed, these spendings in Allah's cause are a means of nearness for them. Allah will admit them to His mercy. Certainly, Allah is oft forgiving, most merciful. So, if you look at these deeds outwardly, there are some Bedouins who are spending, and there are other Bedouins who are spending. And Allah is treating these 2 groups very differently. The one group is spending grudgingly, so their spending is not bringing them reward. And the other group, they're spending wholeheartedly, with the intention of being brought close to Allah by their spending. So the two groups are not being treated in the same way by Allah, even though the outer action looks similar. And there's another passage which one of our colleagues pointed out, which is a very subtle indication. In Surah Al-Rum, there's a passage which, the gist of the passage with relation to the money that you give in loans with the intention of taking more back later, that does not increase with Allah. That which you give as charity, that increases. So the relevance of that passage to this issue is that the way that riba worked in Jahiliyyah was not the way it works in the modern banking system. The modern banking system, the increase is built into the contract from day one. In the pre-Islamic Arab society, in principle, a loan was a charitable act. If you borrow 1,000, on the payment day, payment is 1,000. But if you can't pay, then debtor would ask the creditor, give me more time and I'll give you more money. So this passage in Surah Al-Rum is saying that people who loan with the intention, hoping that they would not be repaid in full on time in order to then start sucking the economic lifeblood out of the debtor, that this is a reprehensible act. So people who were giving these loans on day one, because there was no stipulation of an increase, you couldn't tell who had which intention, to help out or to exploit. But Allah knows the intention, and based upon the intention, He was declaring that that was how He was going to treat people. This was the first Quranic statement about riba at a time when it had not yet been prohibited outright. So it was preparing the minds of the Muslims that this kind of behavior is not good. And then by a process of gradual legislation, then it eventually became completely prohibited. So to return to the maxim, in looking at intention, the scholars have actually gone into what goes on in a person's mind and analyzed the different stages by which intention develops. And so the first stage is called hajis. It means it's just like a glimmer of a thought, something just kind of barely emerging out of your subconscious. And then you have what's called khatir. The thought actually crosses your mental screen so that you're aware of it, fully, consciously aware of it. But it's a brief crossing of your mental screen. And then that's followed by hadith an-nafs, which means that you start turning it over in your mind. You're thinking about it. You're weighing the pros and cons of doing this action. And then that ripens into something called ham, where the balance is starting to tilt towards doing it. And then it becomes azam. You take the full decision that this is something I want to do, and you're now ready to use the means necessary to accomplish that act. So the Prophet ﷺ, in a famous hadith narrated by Bukhari and Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ تَجَاوَزَ عَنْ أُمَّتِي مَا حَدَّثَتْ بِهِ أَنفُسَهَا مَا لَمْ يَتَكَلَّمُوا أَوْ يَعْمَلُوا بِهِ. Allah has pardoned or excused my ummah regarding their thoughts, hadith an-nafs, that which they speak about inside their minds, that which they turn over in their minds. He has forgiven that, or He has chosen not to take people to account for that, as long as they don't actually say it or act upon it. And then in another hadith, he used the term hum. So this is one step higher as far as resolve goes than hadith al-nafs. So he said, Man hum bihasanatin fa'amilaha falahu asharatu ad'afiha ila sab'ati mi'ati da'fin aw akthar. Bima'na al-hadith. Whoever intends to do a good act, forms that hum to do a good act, and he does it, he'll get 10-fold reward or 700-fold reward or more than that, as Allah wills. And if the person makes the hum to do a good deed, but for some reason is unable to do it, then he still gets a single reward for having that hum. On the other hand, if the person has a hum to do an evil deed, but he doesn't do it out of fear of Allah, then Allah, He will write a reward, a single reward, for not doing it. And if he does it, then he gets a single black mark in his account. So this is the generosity of Allah, that He rewards people for good intentions, and He doesn't take them to account for bad intentions until they actually act upon them. So we're going to take a short break and we'll be back soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back. So we're discussing al-umuru bi-maqasidiha. Affairs are only properly judged by taking intentions or objectives into account. So we talked about the Sharia basis for the maxim, and we talked about some of the terminology related to it. And then in another hadith, he used the term hum. So this is one step higher as far as resolve goes than hadith al-nafs. So he said, Man hum bihasanatin fa'amilaha falahu asharatu ad'afiha ila sab'ati mi'ati da'fin aw akthar. Bima'na al-hadith. Whoever intends to do a good act, forms that hum to do a good act, and he does it, he'll get 10-fold reward or 700-fold reward or more than that, as Allah wills. And if the person makes the hum to do a good deed, but for some reason is unable to do it, then he still gets a single reward for having that hum. On the other hand, if the person has a hum to do an evil deed, but he doesn't do it out of fear of Allah, then Allah, He will write a reward, a single reward, for not doing it. And if he does it, then he gets a single black mark in his account. So this is the generosity of Allah, that He rewards people for good intentions, and He doesn't take them to account for bad intentions until they actually act upon them. Now, the scholars, they did a bit more analysis on the rules of intention. For an act to be acceptable, even if the intention is good, that's not enough by itself. The act also has to be in conformity with the Sharia. So one example that's given in that regard is a person wants to benefit the community by building a well, but he builds it in a place where people are always walking by there and there's no protection. I mean, this is a classical example. I mean, it's hard to imagine that occurring in a modern society. But in ancient times, that was something that could happen. So there's just this hole in the ground, and there's no protective wall around it, and people are coming and going. This act, even though the person's intention was good, is unacceptable because the act is outwardly not in conformity with the Sharia. It's endangering people. So that's one issue. The flip issue is when the act is outwardly in conformity with the Sharia, but the intention of the person doing it is not to achieve the goal that was intended by the lawgiver in permitting that act. Now, a really famous and controversial example of this in fiqh is what's called bay' al-'ina. A sale is perfectly lawful, and it is also lawful to charge more for a delayed payment sale. If I come in today to a showroom and put down 12,000 US dollars, I can walk out with a car. If I come into a showroom and put down 1,000 US dollars, it's also possible to walk out with a car. But the person who's selling me the car, he's only getting $1,000 worth of immediate benefit, whereas the buyer is getting the full benefit of the car in both cases. So if the seller is only getting partial benefit and the buyer is getting full benefit from the delayed payment transaction, there's some element of injustice there, unfairness. So a markup on a delayed payment sale is lawful. There is some minor disagreement about that. There was minor disagreement about that in the historical era, but it was minor disagreement. The way that it works now in Islamic finance, though, is that either it's already known, that this is what's going to happen, and therefore, al-ma'rufu urfan kal-mashruti shartan, that which is known by custom is like something which is stipulated by a contractual term. When that is what's going on in a society, then it has its own hukum. You can't say that this is an innocent transaction where the person just happened to decide after buying the good that he doesn't really need it, decides to sell it back to the same person. There are so much indicators that this is just a way to clothe a riba transaction in the garments of a sale that it's widely rejected by most Sharia scholars in the field of Islamic finance. There are some who still adhering to it, but it's becoming less and less tenable, and it's starting to be eliminated across the board. Now, when you look at intention, another issue of intention with regard to just basic fiqh issues is that, for instance, when you're doing an act of worship, you should know what act of worship you're doing, and your intention for it should be clear. I remember once, it was Asr time, I was working at a Muslim institute in suburban Washington, and the sky got really dark. It was like a tornado was about to come. And they called the adhan for Asr, and we went, and we prayed 4 rakats, and then one of the people in the Jama'ah, he said, 4 rakats? What salat are we praying here? And we said, it's Asr. He said, oh, I made the intention for Maghrib, because it was so dark outside, he forgot what salat it was. So, he had to repeat his salat because his intention didn't match with what he was supposed to be doing. That's a very technical aspect of intention, which rarely comes up in real life, but occasionally it could. But also, it comes up in the sense that you should know what you're doing before you do it, and your intention should be firm. So, I'm going to pray, I'm by myself in the musalla, somebody might come in, I'll start out with sunnah, but if somebody comes and then joins me, I'll turn it into fard. No, you cannot do that. So you have to have clear sense of what you're doing. For certain kinds of actions, you can actually combine the intentions. Like if it's an optional salat, you just made wudu and you just walked into the masjid and you're about to pray dhuhr, you can combine your intention. You're making tahiyyatul wudu, tahiyyatul masjid, the sunnah ratiba of dhuhr. But for obligatory acts of worship, you can't do that. You can't make the intention that I'm going to pray Asr for today and for all the Asrs for the rest of my life. It doesn't work. And the same thing with regard to Ramadan. You can't make the intention for a nafil fast during Ramadan because there's only enough time for one fast, and there's only one intention that you can make at that time, which is for the obligatory fasting. So the time is drawing short. There are many more things to talk about with regard to this. For instance, with regard to a judge, judges are supposed to pass judgment based upon tangible external evidence, as per the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said, "You come to me with your disputes and I judge based upon what I hear." But sometimes a judge may take into account intention, like a man made an ambivalent statement that could be construed as divorce, and it comes before a judge. He would ask the man, "Well, what did you intend?" Also, there are cases where a person may do an act and you can tell by clues whether there was intentional or mistake. You know, a father and a son are out in the forest, they're hunting, and you know, the father fires the gun, you know, they've separated, he fires from a distance and it happens to hit his son. You know, there was no previous animosity between them. The clear indications there would be, or the dominant, you know, a judge would give, is that this was an accident. Whereas if there are two people who have past history of enmity, you know, and one of them happens to hit the other guy with a car, you know, then the case starts to build up that, wait a minute, you know, was this person acting, did he really want to kill this person or not? So intention can sometimes be gleaned from contextual clues. And based on how strong those clues are, then a judgment could be rendered to infer the intention of the actor. Another application of the maxim is with regard to zakat. A person buys a house and they're living in that house. They don't pay zakat on it. They move out of the house and then they put that house up on the market. So that's now a kind of a property that zakat would be due on if it lasts, you know, if it's still in his possession for a year. Sometimes it's hard to sell houses. So these are the kind of issues that this maxim covers. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.